Imagine a company so powerful, it had its own army, a company that could wage wars, collect taxes, make laws, and topple kings, all while turning massive profits. This wasn't fiction. This was the East India Company, the corporation that didn't just do business, it colonized an entire nation. Today, we peel back the layers of polished history and expose the brutal truth behind the world's first corporate empire. From trade routes to tyranny, this is the story of how profit led to plunder and how a nation was sold piece by piece. You've heard history, but not like this. Welcome to South Sphere Studios, the underground lair of untold stories, twisted power plays, and the people history try to forget. We don't just tell stories, we expose the plot twists of the past. Let's rewind the clock, all the way back to the year 1600. England was still a relatively minor player on the world stage. But one thing was clear. The East was where the money was, spices, silks, and stories of unimaginable wealth. So on December 31st, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter and with a stroke of the pen gave birth to what would become the most powerful corporation in history, the East India Company. At the time, it was just a group of merchants chasing pepper and cloves in the East Indies, today's Southeast Asia. But the early days? Far from glorious. The Dutch and Portuguese were already seasoned veterans of the spice trade. The company, fresh and overconfident, struggled to carve out its place. Ships were lost, deals collapsed, fortunes vanished. So, like any cunning opportunist, the company changed tactics. If the East Indies were taken, then why not look west of the Indies? Why not try India? A land rich not only in goods, but in opportunity. And that's where the seeds of empire were quietly sown. The company began planting flags not with armies, but with trade posts, little beachheads of British ambition. First came Surat, then Madras, today's Chennai, then Bombay, now Mumbai, and finally the jewel in their commercial crown, Calcutta or Kolkata. Each post started as a humble trading hub, but behind the scenes they were transforming into something far more dangerous. Because while the world still saw a company, what was growing in India wasn't a business. It was the skeleton of an empire. And soon it would demand blood, gold, and control. What happens when a trading company stops being content with profits and starts craving power? In the 18th century, the East India Company crossed a dangerous line. It no longer just traded goods. It began playing politics like a seasoned emperor. But unlike kings and conquerors, the company didn't march with armies first. It moved through whispers, handshakes, and gold-filled ledgers. Across India, regional rulers were locked in rivalry. Kingdoms were cracking from within, weakened by succession crises, civil wars, and power-hungry ministers. The company saw opportunity, and it moved in with a strategy honed in a boardroom, alliances and bribery. They picked sides in local disputes, funded rebellions, and backed one prince against another, not out of loyalty, but because chaos made conquest easier. In exchange for support, the company demanded land, tax rights, and trade monopolies. And once they had a foot in the door, they never left. Then came the moment that changed everything. The Battle of Plassey in 1757. It wasn't just a battle, it was a setup. The company, led by Robert Clive, struck a deal with Mir Jafar, a commander in the Nawab of Bengal's army. Promised power and a throne, Mir Jafar betrayed his own ruler. And when the smoke cleared, the Nawab was dead, and Bengal, one of the richest provinces in the world, was in company hands. That day, a traitor became a tyrant, but the company didn't rule openly. No, it preferred to pull the strings. What followed was the sinister elegance of the dual government system. Local rulers were kept on their thrones, but only as puppets. The company controlled the real levers of power: taxation, law, military, and administration. It was colonialism wearing a business suit. The company collected taxes from Indian peasants and used that very money to fund more wars, bribe more officials, and tighten its grip. It turned India's wealth into the fuel for its own domination, and all of it started with a trade deal. If the East India Company had a heart, it beat not for the people, but for profit. Once it had its hands on India's political reins, it began squeezing the land dry. What followed wasn't just colonization, it was economic warfare. The riches of India, the spices, the cotton, the silks, the jewels, were no longer traded. They were extracted. The company sucked the subcontinent's wealth like a leech. The gold flowed east to west. The glory flowed west to east. And India? It bled quietly. This was the era of the great drain of wealth. Traditional industries were crushed under the company's boot, none more so than India's world-famous textile trade. Once the envy of Europe, Indian weavers suddenly found themselves outlawed, overtaxed, and unemployed. British factories produced cheap textiles, and India, the land that once clothed the world, became just another consumer of foreign goods. And the monopolies? Ruthless. The company controlled salt, opium, and textiles, essentials and exports alike. Prices were fixed, competition was crushed, and corruption ran wild. Company officials weren't just employees. They were pirates in powdered wigs. They looted treasuries, demanded bribes, and sent fortunes back to Britain, while entire communities in India starved. Speaking of starvation, nothing exposes the company's inhumanity like the Bengal famine of 1770. Up to 10 million lives were lost. A quarter of Bengal's population. Crops failed, but taxes stayed high. Grain was hoarded, relief was absent, and the company, it looked the other way. Some of its officials even speculated in rice, driving prices higher as people collapsed in the streets. For them, death wasn't a tragedy, it was an inconvenience. Profit had become policy, mismanagement was the norm, and human life, just another line on a balance sheet. Under the banner of trade, the East India Company didn't just colonize India, it crippled it. You can rob a land, you can silence its rulers, you can drain its wealth, But for how long can you hold down its people before they rise? The East India Company had bled India dry, economically, politically, culturally, and as its grip tightened, the anger began to boil. Slowly at first, then all at once. Across the subcontinent, the signs of growing discontent were everywhere. Farmers and peasants, crushed under impossible taxes, picked up whatever weapons they could. Princely states, once allies of the company, turned hostile after betrayals and broken promises. And perhaps most dangerously of all, the company's own army began to turn on it. The sepoys, Indian soldiers employed by the company, had had enough. Years of low pay, racial discrimination, and disrespect toward their religion had sown deep resentment. The final spark? A rifle cartridge rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, an insult to both Hindu and Muslim beliefs. And in 1857, the powder keg exploded. What began as a mutiny turned into a full-scale rebellion. From Meerut to Delhi, Kanpur to Lucknow, the country lit up in defiance. Sepoys, civilians, royals, people from all walks of life joined hands to drive the company out. For a brief burning moment, it looked like the tide had turned. But the rebellion, though fierce, was fragmented. The British regrouped. They retaliated with brutal force. Entire villages were wiped out. Rebels were executed en masse, and the old empire struck back harder than ever. The uprising was crushed, but the message was clear. The company's time was up. In 1858, the British Crown officially dissolved the East India Company. The Queen took direct control of India, ushering in the age of the British Raj. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The company had left behind a legacy of stolen wealth, shattered societies, and a country still struggling to heal. And yet, the rebellion lit a flame. It was not the end, but the beginning of something greater, a movement, a memory, a fight that would echo for generations. The East India Company may have been dissolved in 1858, but its shadow stretched far beyond its formal end. You can kill the beast, but its claws still tear through history. The company didn't just plunder India's wealth. It built an entire system of exploitation. And those systems, they didn't vanish with a stroke of the pen. First, there was the colonial blueprint. The company laid the foundations for British rule in India, but not just through military might. No, this was far more insidious. It designed an administrative system, economic policies, and legal frameworks meant to exploit, control, and extract as much as possible from India's people and resources. The legacy of that system was one of deep economic scars. The textile industry was destroyed, local economies crumbled, and vast wealth flowed west while India remained impoverished. It was a blueprint for exploitation that was carried out by the British Crown after the company was dissolved. But it was the company that started the machine. And let's not forget the cultural impact. The company didn't just strip India of its wealth, it sought to strip it of its identity. Local industries were replaced by British-run factories. Traditional knowledge was disregarded, and the British imposed their own culture as superior. India's rich heritage was undervalued, misrepresented, or even destroyed. But from the ruins, something rose. The long-term consequences of the company's rule sparked a sense of nationalism, a growing fire of rebellion that would eventually ignite India's fight for independence. The First War of Independence in 1857 was just the beginning, and the echoes of resistance reverberated throughout the next century. The memory of the East India Company's brutality sparked movements, not only against the British but for the soul of India itself. From Gandhi to Subhas Chandra Bose, from Tagore to Nehru, the dream of independence was fueled by the legacy of the company's ruinous control. But here's a twist. The company might be gone, but the parallels with modern geopolitics are undeniable. Today, multinational corporations wield influence that can rival nations. They control markets, manipulate governments, and extract resources with little regard for the consequences. Does this sound familiar? The East India Company was the first corporation to act as a de facto colonial empire. And today, corporations continue to shape world events, sometimes more powerfully than governments themselves. In many ways, we still live with the consequences of that corporate power. The legacy of the East Indian Company is not just a chapter in history, but a living, breathing part of the world today. From traders to tyrants, the East India Company's rise to power is a chilling reminder of what happens when corporate greed goes unchecked. A company that started as a group of merchants ended up reshaping an entire nation, leaving a legacy of exploitation that still echoes today. But what do you think? What are your thoughts on this forgotten empire of commerce? Did the East India Company set a precedent for modern-day corporate giants? Drop your opinions in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And hey, if you know someone who loves history or is fascinated by untold stories, share this episode with them. Let's spread the truth together. Thanks for tuning in to South Sphere Studios, where history is anything but ordinary. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and always keep digging for the stories that shape our world.